You're listening to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. I'm your host, Rachel Land. This podcast brings you information and resources to enhance the therapeutic effects of your practice based on a deeper understanding of anatomy, physiology, and the integration of modern science and research with traditional practices and experiences. Join me and my co-hosts Tiffany Cruikshank and Katya Bach as we dive into all things yoga, research, and wellness.
The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.
Welcome to the Yoga Medicine Podcast, Diane. I am really looking forward to talking to you today about how we can navigate uncertainty with a little bit more grace. So let's start by talking first about your professional background and qualifications, and perhaps a little about what drew you to psychology as a field of study.
Oh, hi, Rachel. Thanks so much for having me. Yes, so it's kind of an interesting story for me finding psychology as an area of study. I actually started as a business major undergrad. When I was 17, 18 and went to college, I really had no idea what I wanted to do. And my parents really pushed me to be a business major. And after a lot of kind of shenanigans of switching my major several times within business and then outside of business, I eventually found psychology through a friend of mine that I worked with at a restaurant. She was a bartender, I was a waitress, and she was in graduate school for psychology and was working on her research project. And when we were, not working, when we were sort of prepping for our work or after work, she would be talking about what she was doing. And I found it incredibly interesting. And it was really the first time that there was an academic field that I was like, ooh, I really want to learn as much as I can about this. And it's not something that I feel is going to overwhelm me in terms of academic pursuit. I had developed a little bit of chemistry fear in high school due to some negative experiences within education and a teacher. And so for me, it was exciting to get back into a science, but not a science at the time that I felt would be, the hard sciences. So
Exciting.
That's why psychology. Yeah, that's how I found that. Yeah.
I love it. We're almost flip sides because my parents were psychology majors and I think would have loved me to go into something education related. And I chose business instead because I thought it would be kind of broad and unfocused. So we're flip sides. I love it.
And we use both.
Yeah. And so what about yoga practice? When did that come into the picture?
So yoga practice, interestingly, I studied a little bit of philosophy undergraduate as well. And so I would say my beginnings of interest in yoga-like practices started when I was about 19 or 20. And I just took a general undergrad philosophy course. So it was kind of touching on every main school of philosophy and more of the famous philosophers at the time. And this was, in the late 80s, early 1990s. And so it wasn't a very diverse group of philosophers that we were studying either. It was a lot of mostly white men, but there were a few interesting Eastern philosophies that were thrown into the mix that I felt really inspired by. And I personally grew up in a Catholic family, and that religion, even though I went through all of the rites of passages and all of the education, it didn't resonate with me. And so my first glimmer of yoga that resonated with me was some of the Eastern philosophy as an undergrad. And then fast forward probably 10, 12 years after that, when I was in graduate school, I had a typical graduate student experience of having back pain, neck pain, lugging all my books around in a backpack, sitting at a computer and in a desk for hours at a time. And so I was getting a massage to help alleviate some muscular tension, and my massage therapist suggested yoga. And so I thought, okay. And it was something that I was open-minded to, because I knew that there was a spiritual component and a movement component, but I really didn't know much of what it was.
Yeah. And what style did you initially start practicing? What did you kind of stumble across?
So here's what's really interesting about that is So I was at university and I was trying to take the free yoga classes that were on campus
Of course.
because I was, a poor graduate student, right, with 3 jobs and no time on my hands. But I kept showing up to the gym and the athletic facility, and I'd even show up 20 minutes early and the classes would be full. I couldn't get into a yoga class. And this was in, maybe in 1999, 2000.
Mm.
So I was like, there's something going on here. Why can't I get into any of these classes? So I looked in the community and I found a studio, and it was an integral yoga studio. And integral yoga is off of Swami Satchidananda's lineage. And Yogaville, one of his ashrams, is within a couple hour radius of where I was attending university. And so there was this studio there. And if you haven't practiced integral yoga, it is a pretty systematic, discrete practice. It has a few different sequences, but it has its order, it has its chants, it has its rituals. And it's at least a 90-minute to 2-hour practice with a long opening of chanting and a long shavasana, like around 15 to 20 minutes. So just to put a little context in there. So I find this studio that has yoga. They are offering it at $30 a month, unlimited for students. So I'm like, okay, I can do this, and I go in and I'm in, like a t-shirt and sweatpants. And I go in and the teacher's dressed in the white and is conducting, this formal practice with chanting and whatnot. And I just kind of sat there and followed along the best that I could. And then Shavasana was funny because I was like, okay, what's going on? In my head, nobody said, you're going to be here for a long time and we'll let you know when to get up. And I had a very active mind and a lot of tension in my body, as my massage therapist noticed. So long and short of it, I was kind of in my head a lot, going through the process. But when it was all said and done and we finished with our closing chant, and again, I was sitting there sort of like this clueless person in the whole process, I had this moment where I was just completely relaxed. My mind was clear. My body felt at ease. And I just knew that this was like the thing, that the behavior that I needed to do in order to reach all the things that I was studying about as a psychologist. It was just like this is the thing. And I just knew it.
Yeah. That's my only really vivid memory of starting yoga practice, was that feeling of my brain and my body being in the same place at the same time. And there's just sort of stillness and quiet and presence that I didn't have anywhere else in my life. So I love the fact that we were, different ends of the world, years apart, and yet it was that exact same experience that drew us to the practice.
It was very profound. And I knew it was like a moment where I stopped to pay attention. And I don't do that often in life. At least I didn't back then. So it was huge. Yeah.
And how did you transition from practicing to teaching? Because I presume your intention at grad school was that you would work in psychology and that would be the path that you'd take.
Yeah, so that was another sort of interesting turn. Well, I will share the original studio. So I was at that studio for about a year as I was finishing up my academic work. And when I left and I was saying goodbye, the owner of the studio, the main teacher, told me I'd be a yoga teacher someday. And I was like, no way, I'm going to be a psychologist and an academic and a researcher. So interestingly, that was the beginning of consistent practice for me. And I was a studio attendee, and that's what I did. So no matter where I moved after that point, I would sign up for the monthly unlimited. And, and I was like taking as many classes and studying with as many teachers as I could. If there were workshops, I was taking workshops. I just was like so into it. Any aspect of it, I was into it. Sponge, reading, everything. So there was a huge excitement for me. And when I moved back to my hometown, which is in Virginia Beach, where I live now, this is where I grew up, I ended up finding a teacher here and started practicing at her studio every day. And she literally, at the time I was a professor at a local university, and she literally wasn't feeling well one day and called me and was like, can you sub my class in a couple of hours? And I was like, no, I'm not a yoga teacher. Like, no, but no.
This is the classic progression from the earlier days of Western yoga, isn't it?
It really is.
You just get the tap on the shoulder. Today it's you. Sorry, it's you.
That's basically what she was like, come on, I really need you. And I really respected her. She was my teacher. I couldn't say no. And she was like, you know how to teach. You're a teacher and you do a lot of yoga. So just get in there and do it. So I did. And I mean, obviously it didn't go horribly. And she ended up offering to mentor me. And so basically from that point on, for that first, I think it was like 3 years, to be honest, I literally taught this donation class every Monday at noon. We donated all the money to the local animal shelter. And this teacher would come and take the class. And so she would take my class, and I'd teach the group that came to the donation class. And then she would sit with me after class and give me feedback and give me things that I could work on. I know.
What an extraordinary opportunity. Wow.
It was, and it was a very close relationship on so many levels. So it was a very pivotal, meaningful, and it was, back to the tradition of teacher to student, one-on-one. But interestingly, after a few years of that, she was like, you need to go get a teacher training because she wanted to offer a 200-hour program. And she was like, I'd love for you to help me put something together. And I said, I can't help you do that because I've never been through the whole process. I can't write a curriculum for something that I've never done. So.
I love that story. That's amazing. So you had such a traditional, really, introduction to yoga practice, that individual teacher to student, the mentoring relationship. And it was only at that point that you got to formal teacher training. Love it.
In the beginning. Yeah. And then that was an interesting journey too, because at that time, now we're going back to like 2007, 2008 in my local community, which has around 1 million residents, but it wouldn't be considered like a large city, but it's a populate. There's things happening here, but back then you had a couple of studios, you had yoga in gyms or, in churches or YMCAs or things like that. And so like teacher trainings locally, there were a couple, but they didn't maybe fit with my schedule, or they weren't, of a curriculum that was what I was looking for at the time. And so at that point, then I was like, okay, I'm going away. I'm going to go and immerse myself into a training. And so at that point, that's what I did.
And so at this point, were you working in research in psychology? Because you have a Bachelor of Science, you have a Master's of Education, and then a PhD in psychology. Yes.
I do. Yeah. So I was actually a college professor at a local small university, and I was in their department of psychology. So I was teaching, and I was writing and publishing and doing all of the different work that a professor does, and was very burned out and very overwhelmed, and really dealing with like a lot of the intense politics of academia as a junior academic at the time. And I was in a tenure track position, but each progressive year I kept questioning if that's where I wanted to be. And it was one of those things where quality of life was really suffering, and sort of the dream, like what my, dream of what this was going to look like for me wasn't matching my reality. And I was starting to kind of face a crisis in life.
So I know you've done a couple of different 200-hour teacher trainings and a range of advanced trainings since.
Yeah.
What was your progression to teaching more full-time? And I know you had a balance of your psychology work and teaching work, but what did the mix look like, before pandemic times?
Yeah. So just to kind of continue the story a little bit. So basically what happened is when I hit that, I went to my teacher training. I went out to California and did a summer in California immersion with Shiva Ray. And it was like a mind-blowing, pivotal experience. And so basically I was just going to come back home and teach 1 or 2 classes a week and continue being on faculty. And the burnout started really getting heavy. And I found myself looking around the walls of my office thinking, God, all I want to do is like yoga and teach yoga and build this other side of myself. And so it literally just, it wasn't like something that was overly planned. It was something that was slowly creeping up on me. And so I literally, by the end of the following academic year, which I had no intention of doing, I decided to turn in my resignation. And really at that point, there was a couple of bridge jobs that I'm not going to go into right now that kind of got me into the yoga, because most of us, it's really hard to leave like a professional job with benefits and a solid salary with all of our, school loan debt and things like that. It can be challenging to take such a big risk, but basically what I did is I eventually decided to open a yoga studio. And so in the years of this, I was like teaching all over town and adding privates and workshops. And so I was kind of like really in the hustle of building myself. So like you mentioned, I added different 200-hour trainings under my belt. There were key teachers that had methods or meditations or things that I was like, oh, let me go do 2 weeks here and immerse myself in this experience. So I was really doing everything I could to not only experientially set myself up to be of service to my community, but also like academically, like I wanted to get the credentials under my belt because that's kind of who I was already, coming into it. So then I eventually found Tiffany, and that was like a huge pivotal teacher and relationship and program for me, because that was where I was really able, for a long time, I kept psychology work. And I had a consulting business outside as well, where I was working with families. So I was still working as a psychologist, but I had like one box that was a psychologist and a separate box that was a yoga teacher. And it was through yoga medicine and really taking in sort of the paradigm of therapeutic work as a yoga modality that I was able to take the work I do and like start to sort of apply it in different ways. And that was really pivotal for me, because Tiffany not only like was supportive of that, but her way of doing things and me being a student of that was so helpful for my own growth.
And how was your work mixture looking pre-pandemic? What did your mix look like?
I was mostly yoga teacher pre-pandemic. So I had really, I wanted it that way. Like, I think I had gotten to a point. So another small business I'd started before pandemic and in the coming 10 years between leaving academics and getting more so into yoga was working as a consultant coach for families and working with behavior modification in the home. And that work I love, but I don't like doing it full time, because I like being able to deal with the stress the family is dealing with in a way that, like, in a grounded way. And I find that if I'm absorbing a lot of that, it's hard for me to integrate my own practices to keep me balanced. So my desired mode prior to the pandemic was like 80% yoga teacher and maybe 20% psychologist. And in that 80% yoga teacher was a lot of therapeutic work with privates. So that was another big growth spurt for me after training with yoga medicine, was adding a lot of private clients, to my workload. And then I had, because of my work, my training with yoga medicine, and then becoming part of the teaching team with yoga medicine, I had been teaching lots of community classes, and I had really cycled back from that because all the travel, I was having to find subs for classes, and I was, it's hard to kind of keep a regular program, momentum going for the students. So I had pretty much backed out of group classes. So I was running mostly workshops, teacher trainings, and privates. And some of my work as a psychologist.
And then I guess we were in a relatively similar boat in that when the pandemic struck, I had a full year scheduled and ready to go. And within a couple of days, all of those plans just dissolved and disappeared. And I know I did a lot of kind of scrambling around to figure out what what my days and weeks and months were going to look like instead. Did you have a similar
Oh, yeah.
experience? Mm.
Yeah, it was really, to be honest, again, like it kind of comes back to, some of the leadership from Tiffany with yoga medicine, because to be honest, my next big things, this was we shut down in March, and my next big things that were coming up were, one of them was the mental health module in
Mm.
Charleston that year, 2020. And so we were like, I mean, everything had been booked, all of our accommodations, our flight, like everything was ready to roll at that
Hmm.
point. So Valerie and Tiffany and I, Valerie Nopik, our other yoga medicine teacher, and we all got on a call, and um, we were all facing a level of uncertainty and a little bit of anxiety, but Tiffany had a really great plan executed for taking it all online, and it just went beautifully, and it served as not only an opportunity for me to look at my own business and think about how to put it online, but it also gave me the confidence and the push to just be
Mm.
like, okay, I'm doing it.
Yeah.
Like, I don't need to like sit around and wonder and resist it. It's like, why not just jump on it and see what happens? There's nothing really to lose.
Yeah.
And it turned out to be a good thing. Yeah.
Yeah. And I had a really similar experience as well. But I guess I just wanted to talk through the fact that when we start to shift our conversation, as we're about to do, to talk about uncertainty, it's not just
Yeah.
theoretical. You were in it the same as the rest of us were in the pandemic, thinking that you had a plan and then seeing that plan completely unravel and having to find alternatives. So to shift to that focus of uncertainty, I wanted
Yeah.
to ask you, from your professional capacity, what is it about uncertainty that seems to unsettle us so much? Because they say, you know,
Yeah.
no news is better than bad news, but that doesn't seem to be the way that people react. No news seems to leave us in this state where, I remember in the mental health module talking about schemas and some of the cognitive
Mhm.
distortions that happen when we're trying to reconcile the world to our schema, and
Mhm.
all of the things that come up, like uh, polarization and catastrophizing and
Mhm.
overgeneralization. I'm
Mhm.
seeing so much of that go on. What is it about uncertainty that
Mhm.
unsettles our brains so much?
Well, interestingly, it actually goes prior to thoughts. There's actually it's our survival mechanism
Mm.
signaling us, and that signal from our bodies and our brains then leads us into some of these different distorted ways of thinking. But it's an interesting thing. So lack of predictability is stressful, right?
Mm.
So if you think about it, if you're in the wild, and you're plotting your path, and all of a sudden the road is closed, and you think that's the only route to find food, you're going to have a stress response to that. And the
Mm.
same thing in life, right? So when we face unpredictability, we have a natural stress response, and that stress response in a sense is adaptable, and that it is enough of a trigger, hopefully, to get us into problem solving mode. The challenge with uncertainty for prolonged periods of time, when we think of something like a pandemic, or we think about something like what's going to happen, and we don't know the end of something like this, is that uncertainty leads to these distorted ways of thinking, which then creates sort of this loop where we
Mm.
have the signals from the environment telling our system that, hey, we need to be on alarm for something, but in the same time, we don't have exactly something to prepare ourselves for, because it's uncertain, it's unpredictable. And then we get caught up in the loop of the tendency to think in a negative way,
Mm.
which then creates more stress. And so, what we want to do is we want to be, one, aware of the fact that we are responding to uncertainty in this way, because that awareness can be really key in helping us to shift things.
Mm. And maybe even the perception that this isn't necessarily a negative reaction. This is our body and our mind trying to help, to make us alert and more likely to see potential solutions. So the stress response isn't something to inherently fear or worry about, but maybe to harness.
It is, and it goes back to if we go back to talking about the mental health module and some concepts that we explore in there, but we talked about this Yerkes-Dodson law, the levels of optimal arousal, and I think that like really fits nicely to our day-to-day life and our long-term life, especially nowadays, right? So it's an inverted U, and the idea is that if you have a U shape, and if you have on the left side the low levels of arousal or physiological energy, right? And so if we have low arousal, we tend to be bored or tired or, frustrated possibly.
Mm-hmm.
If we, as complexity in life increases, we tend to get more aroused, right? And so we get up to a level of a peak. But then if we have too much arousal as we go further to the right, we tend to then have a decline in our capacity to perform or to evaluate a situation or to use our higher order thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's really about finding that sweet spot, because as we're going up the level in terms of like dopamine release in the brain or adrenaline release in the brain, that those chemicals that actually stimulate us to get like excited and motivated about something, we can reach a level of like a peak with that, and then we can get into a state of problem solving and focus. But if we get into prolonged states of uncertainty or prolonged states of stress, what happens is that we overtax our system and we get mainly into a physiological stress response, which shuts down memory, which shuts down the ability to focus, and we get into that more of that negative loop. So it's just like a real tricky cycle that we can get into if we're not careful.
Yeah, I love that you started this by talking about awareness, because that's really the magic, the sort of secret sauce of yoga practice, isn't it? That it gives us the capacity to take a step back from what we're in and see it with a little bit more perspective. And I think sometimes we get the impression in yoga that we should always be kind of calm and tranquil and nothing should faze us. So I love that reminder that a certain amount of vigilance and alertness and focus can actually be hugely helpful. It's not something to be feared, it's something to be harnessed, and just to be aware of when that dose tips from enough into too much, perhaps.
Yeah, harnessed and trained, I would say. Like, and that's why I love the mindfulness and the meditation practices, and even the interoceptive practices and the embodiment practices. It's like we can train a level of awareness from head to toe, from outer to inner, right? And the more that we cultivate that, that's when we start to understand those very signals that lead to like those anxious feelings related to uncertainty. And we have three options then. If we want to, move to the other side of that, right? We have three options. We can either change ourselves. And to me, the changing ourselves is that capacity to change our physiology. So does my meditation practice or my breath practice help me in the moment when I'm like freaking out over uncertainty? Maybe, probably. But where it really helps me is if I meditate or if I work with breath every day and I change my baseline reactivity level, then when uncertainty creeps up on me, I'm likely going to respond in a more balanced way over time. And that's really what I think is key. It's yes, can we use these as like little symptom checkers? Sure. Like I can drop right into a breath practice and shift my heart rate, right? And maybe clear my mind. But what is it, the power of it, if we do a little bit of it 2 to 3 minutes every day or 5 days a week? Maybe that could actually shift the entire landscape of how we approach life. So that to me is option one. Option two is you can change your relationship to the situation. And to me, that's the schema, the cognitive approach. So I can think about it differently. I can look at it differently. I can step back from a situation and maybe take a larger point of view. You and I were having a conversation and there's a lot of stressful things and uncertainty happening during a pandemic, but there's also other things that we can appreciate about what has shifted during this time, so we can think about things differently. We can change our relationship to that particular uncertainty. And then the third way is to shift the situation. And that might be the pivot that we make with our businesses, right? So it's like, okay, now I'm going to take everything on my travel schedule and I'm going to book it into a Zoom meeting and, and carry on. Or I'm going to maybe shift my business from group interaction to one-on-one interaction, right? Or there's something along those ways. So I like to think of it as like, I can shift my physiology, I can shift my relationship to the situation, or I can try to shift the situation. In some cases, people are leaving situations. I'm leaving this job, I'm leaving this relationship. I'm going to get out of this to give myself space to, feel better again.
I think that's hugely powerful, because
yeah,
we can kind of use yoga practice in any one of those three options. But I think sometimes people get a little stuck in the third one of, there are some aspects of the situation that I can't change, or maybe I'm in a job that I can't shift to online, and they just get stuck in that. Now there's nothing I can do. Now there's nothing I can do. And remembering that there are still other options. Even if you can't change any aspect of the situation, you can still change your relationship to it, and you can still shift your entire baseline. And when you do that, sometimes that opens up the capacity for you to see other possibilities that you might not have seen in that really vigilant fight or flight kind of state.
it's so true. I mean, and that's the thing. And so for, if you want to come on the other side of it, and if you're contending, especially with the cognitive aspect of, it could be cognitive or could be reality. I mean, some people cannot leave their situations, right? They'd be homeless, or they, whatever. So if they cannot change their situation, can it, again, given that it's not like a dangerous situation, so, putting that qualification out there, but is there a way to look at how they're cognitively approaching it? And that doesn't have to shift right away. And that's where the awareness and the mindfulness practice to me comes in. It's like just observing it and maybe writing it down. Today, I'm feeling like this around uncertainty. And that's where we can bring in a little bit of the philosophy practice, is like working with acceptance, or working with like identifying resistance, right? Like, so how does it feel when I write down about, my feelings or my thoughts on uncertainty, and like, do I have like a really intense response to that? Or is it something that over time I can learn to accept and just see it as it is, what it is? It's just like, I don't like uncertainty, and that's okay.
I think you lean in your practice and in your teaching a little bit more toward the philosophical and the spiritual side of things. So I wonder, is that where you've been leaning in your practice in the past couple of years to support you personally through all the changes that the pandemic has brought? Or are there other aspects of your practice that you've found really supportive?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think I was leaning into those practices before the pandemic, because I also was facing a lot of big things in life, a lot of big transitions and losses and grief. And so for me, I tend to cope with life through diving deeper into those very abysses. I'm someone that, and I openly share, like, I'm someone who also has struggled with depression my entire life. And so for me, studying psychology was like incredibly healing for me to even just understand that better. And then now also, like, bringing in the relationship of these yoga and mindfulness practices for mood, for, fear, for, addiction, things like that. But I lean into that. I lean a lot now into the slowing down. And I don't know if it is definitely, I was going to say, I don't know if that's my age or the pandemic, but that was just about a bunch of BS I was about to serve you, because it is because of the pandemic. Because I mean, you were with me. You and I were both running around the world at high speed. And when we were home, we were like just trying to, get the businesses, keep life happening. And it was a really, I feel like you and a few other people could really understand like what our lives were like in 2018 and 2019. And so For me, I think that I leaned as a poor coping mechanism into like that addiction to work. I love what I do, right? So it's easy for me to do that. Since the pandemic, I'm leaning truly into my relationships. I'm leaning into being outside in nature. I'm leaning into a lot of yoga nidra. And I've gotten really into yoga nidra. And I've always been into meditation and pranayama, but those practices, slow flow is kind of my thing right now.
Yeah.
Loving movement and flowy movement. I haven't been last year I was really into yin. This year I'm less yin. So I'm just kind of listening, and I'm really into the neuroscience stuff. I work now with a neuroscientist, so I'm learning all this super cool stuff. So like one of the things I do, if you guys follow Huberman, he talks a lot about the sunlight in the morning or looking at the horizon line. I've gotten really into like changing like visual perceptual fields and playing with that as like a stress reduction technique. I'm in front of the computer a lot more now. So I'm trying to do lots of different things with my visual field and like thinking about the parasympathetic nerves in the face and the neck. I'm doing a lot of body work now. I'm receiving a lot of body work. I'm not doing it. I'm receiving it. So yeah, I'm leaning into lots of things and just enjoying more time, because for those of us that traveled or even drove around town a lot, I feel like my time was planning for travel, traveling, or in a car, getting from A to B. And now I'm taking all of those moments and like enjoying presence, which is really cool.
I love how you communicated how much your practice has changed and will continue to change. And it's one of the things that I think has kept me coming back to yoga for 30 odd years is, at times I want something really vigorous. Even at times at the moment, I just want to move quickly and shake off tension and frustration and be in my body and sweat a little bit. And other times I want to move with a little bit more kind of languidness and linger and feel. And sometimes I want to be still and quiet. And sometimes I want to be outside. And I think creating space to arrive with that open-ended question of what do I need? What am I needing at the moment? What will support me? What balances out what I'm doing in the rest of my life? That's so important to look after ourselves through our practice, I think.
Totally agree. It's funny, like even yesterday, this came up for me. We were pet sitting a friend's dog, and so we were getting no sleep because the two dogs were having so much fun. They were like partying on the bed all night, and wrestling each other all hours. So we were sleep deprived for like 4 nights. And yesterday it was beautiful out, and I was like, "Let's go for a bike ride." And my husband was kind of like, "Are you sure? It's, I'm tired. It's hot out." And I'm like, "No." And we hopped on our bikes, and like 15 minutes in, I was like, "You know what? We're not going to go up that big hill and down." I cut the bike ride short, and he was really thankful. But it was like one of those things, like even on a Sunday, a lot of us are like, "Oh, we want to get our exercise in," and and it was like one of those moments where even in that moment, I was able to back up and be like, "Wow, I've been really tired the past 4 days. Like maybe I don't need that 10-mile vigorous bike ride. Maybe just a gentle little, cycle around the neighborhood and home in 20 minutes will
be
suffice."
outside, get some sun, feel the air, and it not have to be this gigantic thing, this big mission.
Right, which to me kind of goes back to that concept of control and uncertainty, because in a sense, I feel like a lot of us, including myself, I'm thinking again before pandemic, I had so many things that I wanted to control in my life, like my work and how hard I worked out. And I've got to do that handstand. And, I've got to do all of these things. There was like this control and this pushing and like this striving, at least for me. And I feel like I still have a lot of goals and energy and motivation, but I'm like, off of like really putting the pedal down full throttle. And
And all it took
can be
was
a gift.
the wheels falling off the entire world.
Yeah, it really did.
Yeah.
And you know what? Maybe if this had happened at another point in my life, I might have fallen apart. I mean, I'm not going to say that that wouldn't have happened. I mean, I think resiliency is another little muscle that we build, and the gift of time can really be something that we lean into in terms of building those different strengths. But
This was
I think
actually something
sorry, go
I
ahead.
was really hoping to talk to you about, because I know post-traumatic growth is a real passion area of yours. And so I just wanted to kind of pick your brain as to, when we do hit difficult times or uncertain times or messy times, what can we do to sort of predispose ourselves towards more positive outcomes like the ones that you're experiencing from the pandemic and I'm experiencing from the pandemic, versus, more negative or traumatic? PTSD is something we've all
Yeah.
heard of. Post-traumatic growth is something we're only just starting to hear about now.
Yeah. And just to qualify this a little bit, there's a lot to look at who turns out on the side of PTSD versus who might turn out on the side of growth. There's some different factors involved. So there's a lot more to the story there. But what we can lean into in terms of making growth more likely is that, one, goes back to kind of what we were just talking about, is this creating this baseline capacity to be able to cope with stress. And that's physical stress, that's physiological stress, that's emotional and mental stress. And so, we can do these more holistic practices. So part of it is our self-care practices. Part of it is, our lifestyle habits. And that's how we fuel ourselves with nutrition.
Mm-hmm.
That's hydration. That's sleep is a big one, in terms of managing our emotions. And then also being willing to learn actual skills for setting boundaries and conflict resolution and things like that. So there's things that we can practice in our day-to-day life that make us more likely to be in a growth-oriented place versus a disordered place. But I will also say that there's a perspective that we can take, and I think that is understanding that growth is not linear. Because I think that the mindset of growth being a line from bottom straight up to top is what gets people in trouble.
100%. I was talking to somebody
Yeah.
yesterday about this in a physical healing capacity of the
Yeah.
body doesn't normally physically heal in that straight line every day. We're 2% better until it's 100%. There's cycles, steps forward, steps back, sideways steps, new things bubble to the surface. So I'm so glad that you're bringing this up to sort of set ourselves free from the expectation that it's only this way, only ever up. Yeah, please dive into that.
Yeah. And so what I love about that then is that you're absolutely right. I mean, and sometimes you're in a place of stagnation, and sometimes you're in a place of almost decline as you are going through this process. And so growth is also signaled by challenge. So the other thing is if you don't have challenge, then you're not going to have growth, because the growth is the lifting out of the challenge. That's part of the definition of what growth is coming from a place that is lower into, if you're looking at it quantitatively. But the other thing is that you're absolutely right. It's the expectation around it, because if we don't get comfortable with the uncomfortable, then we have a hard time with the psychological grit that's needed. And grit is the capacity to stay in the struggle. So psychological grit is being able to handle the stress, to cope with the stress and keep it at a moderate level, and at the same time withstand the struggle long enough to maintain that next little hop of growth.
And I think you've
so,
kind of highlighted that as being something that you're naturally good at. You quite enjoy kind of diving into the dark place and figuring things out.
Yeah.
It's definitely not my strong suit, but even for me in yoga practice, I can create a stress that I feel safe in, like a physical stress,
Yeah.
holding chair pose or holding warrior three, and just practice handling stress in a place that feels really manageable to me, where I know the outcome doesn't matter, and work some of the same muscles. So, we, even when it comes to our yoga practice, we can
Yeah.
harness it to build that resilience in a couple of different ways, as well as shifting the baseline, as you were talking about.
Yeah, I think the yoga mat is a beautiful place to practice these lessons, and it can, and if you even go into going back to like yoga philosophy, I mean,
Mm.
like if you go into the kosha system of understanding, it would start a lesson of resilience, probably would start at the physical level with understanding a tension or a strength relationship or something like that, or what that feels like in the body. And then that goes back to awareness and feeling again, because like for your example, Rachel, you're feeling this, right? You're in the moment, in the mat, feeling like the stress and the resistance and maybe the opportunity for growth. And I would say the same thing happens mentally and emotionally. And where the opportunity for growth is in being able to be with feelings.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been saying this a lot over the pandemic, but somewhere along the line before the pandemic, in the last 20 years, feelings got a bad rap. And it was like, it's not okay for certain people to have feelings.
Mm-hmm.
We put some
Positive
people
vibes
like
only.
males, yeah, positive vibes only, good vibes only. We've masked we've created like these flat faces.
Mm-hmm.
We do all of these things to cover up anything negative and make, we have these, social media that tends to brighten up a lot of our ways.
Mm-hmm.
And I love nowadays though that people are more authentic and real. And I think that we're in a really special time in both the yoga world as well as the world of mental health, because now people are like, I have feelings, I'm breaking down, this can't go on like this. There's got to be a different way. And so
Mm.
there's people like myself, as well as many other researchers and teachers out there that are saying like, hey, we've got many, many years of science behind resiliency, behind growth, behind, coping with stress in ways. And now we have, which we didn't have when I was in grad school, we have the neuroscience that helps us understand like what's happening and where it's happening in the brain. And back when I was in grad school, we weren't learning about the brain scan imaging, and these didn't have the technology in the same way they do now.
Mm.
So we have a lot of information at our disposal, but it's not popular conversation yet. And so unfortunately, it seems like it takes like the breakdown for the breakthrough.
Yeah. And we want it to be
And
neat and tidy, don't we? We want it to be
yeah.
like, I was in a really dark place, but now there's a bow on it and I've come through the other side and I'm fine. We're a little bit less tolerant of the messiness of still being in it.
Mm-hmm. I see that too. Yeah.
Mm. So you've talked about mindfulness and awareness. You've talked about shifting our baseline. You've talked about building our resilience by kind of practicing sitting in the feelings and being with the discomfort, and not making that more than it is, but accepting it for what it is. Are there any other kind of tips that you'd add to help people bias themselves towards growth?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's always a good idea to work with someone, whether that be another mental health professional or somebody who has a background in, coaching people into different states like this. I think that social support is key
Mm.
also in terms of resiliency and growth. And so finding those people who are like really on your team and want to see good in your life, and weeding out those different interactions that aren't supporting you and promoting your growth. And then I think that it's really key to set yourself up. If you're thinking of this in terms of like work life, you want to be in a good place in terms of challenge and skills. Like we call it in the work that I do, we call it the challenge skills ratio. So going back to that level, that optimal arousal, like having something that's like right above your skill level and that you find like a little bit challenging, that you get excited to like dive into, to the point where time seems to like float on by and you're like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize I just was doing this for the last 4 hours. That can be really great for growth, because it also enhances neuroplasticity and memory and decision making, which then it can apply to other areas of life. So yeah, I would say that. And then feedback in terms of like, if you're finding yourself, I felt like the other yoga teachers in the community were really key for me as I transitioned my business and during uncertainty. So like teacher groups, business coaches, getting feedback on what other people are doing or what I'm doing, and ways that I can, use that as a motivational tool to, grow what I'm doing and offering, or to expand, my capacity to come up with different ideas to meet people where they're at. So there's lots of ways, like you don't have to do it all on your own. Like remember that community, we are social beings, and that we can really not only be supported by others, but we can be inspired and get feedback in a way to motivate ourselves to grow and make big changes.
And that's a big part of my motivation for helping create this podcast, is to create that feeling of community, to share ideas and inspiration, and even to see somebody doing something that challenges you that little bit, that inspires you to shift yourself a little bit further up that curve of alertness and arousal, as you were saying. Yeah, I think it's something that I don't always think about, sitting in my house in New Zealand by myself most of the time, but I think those social connections, those community connections, whether it's in person or online, can be so powerful.
I agree. I at least have gotten to the point, I'm at home, I'm, alone a lot. I've got the dog or whatever, but I've gotten to the point, like, to me, I've learned how to feel. This is an example of kind of changing your relationship to something. So I think many of us have felt like, oh, I don't want to be on the computer. I don't, a lot of us have had those I don't wants, I don't likes. But for me, and now to me, this feels like I'm in the same room sitting across the table from you, so I just choose to look at it that way for now. And I'm enjoying it.
And we have more motivation to connect with people than we used to, because the pandemic for a lot of us has really highlighted the fact that we miss those opportunities to get together. And it's kind of increased the motivation to make the situation happen where we do get to connect.
I agree. And I think it's been, for me, I've noticed it's been, even in my local community, I feel like neighbors are, a little bit more trying to create little gatherings at the, where the dogs are playing, or, something like that. And I would say, I think really what it is for us, living in a time where we're both sharing, some of us, a lot of us are spending half of our time in front of a computer and half of our time, alone, would be being super intentional about it. So like, it's like we have this conversation, here we are face to face, and then I'm going to have, a break. I mean, for me, it's nighttime, so I'm just going to power down. But if this were earlier in my day, I would take a half-hour break. I would log off. I would go look at the sky. I would, I would do something where I wasn't having to like use my brain and use my five senses, and, just kind of like let myself reset. And then, I found that that's been a good way to approach it. And then also have, in that power down time, like have meaningful connection, like say hello to that neighbor, or,
So the same sort of
call.
intentionality that you bring to your yoga practice. What do I need to balance that out? What will help me return to that baseline, to my sort of natural state?
Yeah, Rachel, I love the way that you actually put that. I've really gotten into like this sort of these questions. It's like, what do I need right now? I've been doing this thing every morning where I wake up, and right when I open my eyes, I've conditioned myself to ask myself, how do I feel right now? I'm trying to do that. Yeah, I'm trying to do that throughout the day.
I think that's one of the most powerful questions, and I have, as you do, a few one-on-one therapeutic clients, and often the question that I ask first and then repeatedly is, how do you feel? How do you really feel? And sometimes I have to guide that. What's going on in your body today? What's going on in your thoughts today? And it just stuns me, the power of asking and honestly answering that question. That in itself might be a huge help to just navigating our way through difficult times. How do I actually feel? What do I need to return me to my natural state?
I actually, I might write this book if it hasn't already been written, but I think awareness is the first step. Awareness is the first step, and that just the pause, right? Just the pause to you ask the question to your student pauses and thinks about that answer,
Maybe for the first time today,
or ever.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't ask us. Like, people are like, "Hi, how are you?" "Oh, I'm fine. How are you?"
Yeah,
You know,
there's
we
that
have
automatic
this,
response.
Script that we just, small talk all our way through life. But that to me is a big question. How do I feel right now? And it changes a lot. And I think when we do that, we also start to then make different choices throughout our day. What am I going to do on my mat?
I think that's a really powerful place to finish it. I think you should write that book. I want to read that book. The power of asking, the pause, and then a really honest answer. And I think if a lot of us built that capacity into our days and lives, we might make some different choices, or we might just create the capacity to see things in a slightly different way.
I think so.
I think you've shared some hugely helpful advice there, Diane, and some really practical ways to think about, am I changing myself? Am I changing my perception? Is there something I can change about my situation? What tools do I have to shift my baseline? Am I practicing getting resilient to stress? There's a lot of really juicy tidbits for people to dive into there. So if they want to learn more about you or the work you do, where would you send them?
Well, I'm a lot of places. I have a website, dianemalaspina.com. That's probably the place you can find all the things. I'm on yoga medicine. I have, I think, 6 classes on yoga medicine online, and I am also one of the teachers for the mental health module. I have a couple of also online courses on yoga medicine. And I'm on Instagram, Diane Malaspina Yoga. I'm on Facebook, Diane Malaspina Yoga and Wellbeing. And I think Instagram or website or yoga medicine sites are the best places where I'm most active.
That's great.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate you sharing your experience and your expertise, and I look forward to catching up with you again.
Oh, thank you so much. It was great to be with you.
Thanks for listening to Yoga Medicine. If you liked the show, be sure to subscribe and leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you got something out of this episode, please spread the word and share it with a friend. You can find more information, articles, trainings, and classes at yogamedicine.com. Check us out on social media as Yoga Medicine, or you can email us at info@yogamedicine.com. Thank you for being part of our yoga medicine community.
The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.